Welcome to the Living the Dream podcast with Curveball. If you believe, you can achieve. Welcome to the Living the Dream with Curveball podcast, a show where I interview guests that teach, motivate, and inspire. Today, I am joined by author, journalist, music and pop fanatic, Andy Frye. Andy has interviewed scores of athletes and rock stars from the Smashing Pumpkins to Shaquille O'Neal. He has written for ESPN, Forbes, and Rolling Stone. He also has his own book. So we're going to be talking to him about everything that he's up to and his experiences interviewing these rock stars and athletes. So Andy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me along.
Why don't you start off by just telling everybody a little bit about yourself?
I wrote a book recently called 90 Days in the 90s, and I've been writing professionally, probably about 12 years. I used to work in a cubicle, worked in the business world for about 20 years, and just started writing, a little on the side, pretty much, I think, to keep myself occupied, keep myself sane. Kind of always did a little bit of writing, but never really had coherent and consistent habits about it until probably like 2009, 2010, and started writing a blog and kind of, spent some time just kind of building some relationships and building some bridges, and got to, cover extreme sports for ESPN. And I guess just sort of along the way grew that to something that was, the same interesting stories about sports and sports business that you may not have heard of. But whereas in the beginning I was interviewing, high school football stars and, people who did all kinds of strange extreme sports, it kind of evolved into this thing where I was interviewing retired sports legends and athletes, some of whom still play in professional sports. And it's been a fun ride. And along the way, just decided to write a book, a little bit about sports, mostly about music about rock and roll, called 90 Days in the 90s. And I completed that a little while ago and published it this summer in June. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Just kind of regular person who's a sports fan, music fan, writing about things that I like to read about and know about. And, along the way decided to get it. I had an idea for a book and decided to pursue it and go forward with it.
So tell us about your favorite athlete and rock star that you've interviewed, and why were they your favorite?
There's probably like 50 different people who are great enough that I could say that was one of my favorites. It's kind of hard to narrow down one or two, because there's so many different personalities, and obviously, when you get to interview someone like Shaquille O'Neal and you're doing a Zoom with Shaq, it's kind of trippy because most of us post-pandemic do Zoom meetings with people that we work with, or maybe for a podcast like this, it's not with celebrity, kind of a worldwide name that everybody knows, and you're doing a Zoom with this person like you would your cousin or whatever. O'Neal was really super laid back. When he was in the NBA, of course, I rooted against him because he was always beating my teams. I grew up in Philly, so I was a Sixers fan, and I've lived in Chicago since 1994, which is more than half my life. So, cheered for the Bulls, particularly when Jordan was with them, when he came back for the second 3 championships. But, we talked about, the role of the big man, which is kind of, I guess, compared to the 70s and 80s when I grew up, centers aren't as sought after as, perimeter shooters like Steph Curry or maybe younger versions of LeBron. But, we talked about business and all the stuff that he does with kids and, kind of raising money and promoting basketball. And I love to have conversations with people that are just fun and conversational. So I've had probably at least 2 dozen that I can think of off the top of my head, where it's been, me having a conversation with a professional athlete or a sports legend, and we're just kind of talking about stuff that we're interested in and what's going on in the world of sports. Billie Jean King was another one. I got to talk to her the second time. The day of Serena Williams' last match, half a dozen Fridays ago, I talked to her actually during the day before Serena's final match. And, it's just kind of like hanging out with someone, just like, someone who talks a lot. And is interested in knowing what you have to say. So I like to kind of engage athletes on sort of just kind of a normal conversational basis. And sometimes you ask them open-ended questions and you just shut up and listen. And they come up with great things. They come up with great things using your articles. And if you're doing a podcast, it's kind of the same thing. But yeah, those are two of them. Like I said, there's probably like another 24 I could talk about. As far as rock stars go, rock stars can be kind of standoffish. Probably one of my favorites was, let me think. I would say, probably a band called Alice in Chains, which is kind of a 90s grunge rock and roll band. And they're still around. They still play. I got to talk to their lead guitarist and principal songwriter, Jerry Cantrell. If you remember the movie Jerry Maguire, there's a scene where Jerry Maguire goes into like a Kinko's copies to get his mission statement printed and produced before he hands it out to everybody in the office and ruins his career. And Jerry Cantrell is a bit part where he plays like the long-haired hippie Kinko's guy, and he's had some other bit parts in movies, but he's really just like an intense rock and roll musician. We'll talk to you about music for hours if you let him. And I got to talk to him a couple of years ago. It was supposed to be about his fantasy football league. It's supposed to be like 15 minutes. And like 45 minutes later, I'm talking to this guy about Led Zeppelin albums from the 70s and playing guitar with people in his living room and NFL football because he's a huge Seattle Seahawks fan. And again, it's kind of boils down to what you connect with on people. Obviously, big names in sports and music are exciting when you get to talk to those people, but I just like having the conversations that I would have with my neighbor across the street. And there's been plenty of those, so I've been lucky in that regard.
Is there anybody famous in the sports or music world that you would like to interview that you haven't got a chance to talk to yet?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a few. Obviously, Serena Williams and Michael Jordan and LeBron. I don't think that they're accessible right now. I'll keep my fingers crossed. But at the same time, I've gotten to interview a lot of really great ones. So I don't know if opportunity comes to interview one of those three, falls in my lap, I'll take it. But we'll see how it goes.
Why do you feel like sports and music are so important in American culture?
I think so. Obviously, sports, music have really only been around, probably, since the beginning of the 20th century. Pro sports kind of formed in, I guess, in some forms in the 1920s and 30s. And obviously, we didn't start consuming sports on TV until there was TVs in the 50s. And we didn't really start listening to rock and roll music until there was FM radio, AM radio, and then FM radio. I don't know. I think kind of makes me, so a little side note, I like to go to museums, and I went to the museum this summer, Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. And they have this weird little wing that has like kind of a historic thing that details like what circuses were like in the 19th century. I was kind of fascinated by this because I was thinking, well, obviously people in like 1875 didn't have TVs, they didn't have radios. I'm guessing they probably didn't listen to live music that much, not like we do, they couldn't turn on a radio. But I guess the point's the fact that at least in the West and in America, North America, we find ourselves needing to be entertained, and maybe it's because we're a big culture. We're influenced by the fact that we're in a big culture, and there's so many different stories and experiences out there that we're just kind of programmed to sort of see what's around and listen. In sports, if you watch even a football game or basketball game that maybe has a low score is not the most exciting. There's obviously storytelling that goes on there that makes us come back the next week to watch the next game. And I think music is the same way, and TV is the same way. So I think music and TV music and sports are just part of pop culture. That's part of the whole thing that we do in the West. It involves, movies and TV and comedy and drama. And I don't know. I feel like we are curious as beings, and we want to know about other people, and we want to learn about other people. And sports and music are kind of two unique ways that we observe each other. I'm not a philosopher or historian, but that's just kind of my thing, that now that we have TV and radio, we didn't have it 300 years ago. We can consume all these things, and that's what we do. So yeah, I guess that's my take on it.
Well, I know by reading through your bio, the 90s are real special to you. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
I think some of it was I was newly out of college. I was in my 20s. Let's say I was 22 in 1994 when I moved here. So it's the kind of time of your life that you kind of move out of the house and start trying to be an adult. So I guess I probably remembered a lot of those experiences. And you think about, we tend to look at the past and think about how great it was. I mean, I think all of us at some point in our life, whether, we all have difficult times in our lives, but there's probably some place in the past where you go, oh, it was really a lot better then, or times were simpler when I was in high school, or when I was just out of college, or when I was single, or when I didn't have any responsibility. We sort of build a narrative around that. I forget sometimes that when I was 22, I was also broke, and dinner was a quesadilla or ramen noodles, and I had to do my own laundry, hauling it down 3 flights of stairs to the bottom of a apartment building with the 4 quarters I could save during the week. But I remember the parts that I was fond of, and some of it was just being in a big city where there's a lot of really cool things going on, and one of those things was music. And also in the 90s, I guess there's a change of scenery in the music business, and in terms of what music was available. Like I was in high school in the 80s, graduated in 1990. To me, like pop radio went for sort of fluffy love songs and the first wing of boy bands like New Kids on the Block to Nirvana and Tribe Called Quest, and artists that wrote their own songs and played their own instruments and were more focused on being creative and not really playing stuff that sounded good on the radio. So maybe that's just my take, but there's so much of it. I mean, I feel like, I'm guessing there's probably going to be history courses taught on contemporary music, and a lot of it is going to be on the 60s with Woodstock and all that and the counterculture. But the 90s have their own thing. I think there's just so much variety. And looking back at the 90s, like the political scene, we had a president, Bill Clinton, who just kind of kept us always tuning in to see what crazy thing would happen next. I mean, compared to the 1970s and 60s when politicians were boring, politicians were not boring. People leading our country were not boring in the 90s. So I think all those things, there's always something interesting going on. And that's what I remember most of it to be.
Explain what time travel fiction is and how you came up with the idea to write time travel fiction.
Yeah, I think time travel fiction, I mean, I didn't even know that it was technically a genre until I saw it slapped on my book, but I guess it makes sense that, I wrote a book about a woman who owns a record store named Darby. She's about my age now, in the present. She finds out about this time travel train that takes, whoever boards it back to the past. And she decides to just kind of stop off in the 90s and reboot her life and sort of do some things over. So, maybe it's a Generation X nostalgia piece, but time travel, it's been around forever, I think. Obviously, we've all seen movies like Back to the Future and Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and there's a ton of them out there. I think so far, I guess I didn't really plan to write a time travel novel. I was walking one day out, just taking a walk, listening to some of my music, and I had this thought, like, wouldn't it be nice to go back in time to like see this band that I loved, or see this artist, or see this or do that. And I got an idea for, well, that actually would be a pretty great book. I guess if I could write a book, about time travel, rather than go back and try to kill Hitler or prevent, world catastrophes from happening. I just had a kind of a more experiential thing. So yeah, I didn't set out originally to create a different spin on time travel, but I think that time travel has been done so many times that I guess the people who are writing time travel, me included, fiction, we should try to do something new with it, rather than, person ends up back in time and they've got to make sure their parents meet and so they still exist in, the future or whatever. I don't read science fiction. So this is definitely, like, I'm not a science fiction guy. This isn't a science fiction book. I think one of the agents that I talked to who passed on the book said, oh, this is a science fiction light, not for me, but good luck. And I don't know, I just kind of fascinated with American pop culture. And I think if I was to go back, let's say to the 60s, which is way before I was born, to see, just what was going on, I'm fascinated with how people dressed in the early 60s with kind of skinny ties. And you think about like Mad Men or a movie like Catch Me If You Can, and then how different it was from like 8 years later in the late 60s when everybody was a hippie and the counterculture movement was going on, and live music was first being done in music fest. So I would observe kind of what people were doing, what they were talking about, how they dressed, how they expressed and carried themselves, whether it's the 60s or the 1920s. I'm just fascinated with those little things. And when I wrote my book about the 90s, 90 Days in the 90s, I kind of wanted to recount that, time period where people were not walking around looking at their phones with Bluetooth devices in their ear. Maybe our clothes were a little different. Obviously, haircuts were a little different. Catchphrases were different. And, what would that look like? And that's what I wrote about, I guess, hanging my little shingle in the time travel fiction space.
Well, what is your top 5 desert island disc?
Oh boy, I knew that was coming. Yeah, I've only got about 50 of those. So ask me 2 days from now, it might be a little different. I'm going to say that I love Tribe Called Quest. And I will say a lot of like people kind of from where I came from, obviously anybody who knows the full history of hip hop knows Tribe Called Quest is one of the influencers. But, I'll just put it this way, like a lot of people who were in college in the 90s who are white and from the suburbs love Tribe Called Quest. I think because we, maybe Public Enemy and NWA were a little, I think they're great, but they weren't for everybody. But, to hear jazz and different influences of music, and I'm going to pick their third album, Midnight Marauders, is my favorite. Came out in 1993. It's a fun album. It's got all kinds of musical influences that are all over the place. So that's one. I'll give you a couple. I don't know if I can come up with the top 5. I love the first album by the Stone Roses. I love the first album. First album by Oasis called Definitely Maybe. I'll just say I'll go with the first album. I love the first album by the Police, Outlandos, which was a little different than what they were doing at the end of their career. And I love Bob Marley, but I like live Bob Marley. So in 2003, Live at the Roxy came out, even though the concert was actually recorded in 1976. I think the difference between listening to Bob Marley's studio albums and listening to his live recordings is they're vastly different in terms of the sound quality. And you actually, you listen to it, shut your eyes, you feel like you're at the concert with Bob Marley sort of dancing in front of you on stage. So yeah, Live at the Roxy by Bob Marley, who played, he actually had an American guitarist, Don Kinsey, who's from Gary, Indiana, who's not too far from Chicago, filled in for, I think, his original guitarist who didn't want to leave Jamaica to come on tour. And so you've got this great blues guitarist playing with Bob Marley, these great reggae songs live, just really great stuff. So I'd say those 5.
Well, tell listeners about your book. Tell us what we can expect when we read it and where we can get it.
Yeah, 90 Days in the 90s, you can get on Amazon or pretty much anywhere you buy books. I do try to encourage people to buy from the local records or local. Yeah, I've got it at some record stores too. I keep saying record stores, or your local bookstore, just a local shop that's independent. I always encourage people to order from there, buy first from there. But if you're on the internet, go to Amazon. I was going to say the Amazon or 90daysintheNineties.com. And it's a book that's mostly takes place in the 90s, but it starts with Darby, who is a record store owner. She kind of was living the high life in New York City when her fiance leaves her, and she makes a couple bad crypto trades and her career falls apart right at the same time that her favorite uncle, who she's lost touch with, dies and wills her this record store back in Chicago. So she moves back to Chicago, takes it over. You kind of pick up in the beginning of the story in the middle of that, where she's just trying to get her life back together. And she's got this great record store, but, she feels guilty that she didn't keep in touch with her uncle. And she has this great record store that he started as she had nothing to do with. And at the same time, gets nostalgic for music and just, the things that had happened in the 90s, which was the last time she'd previously lived in Chicago. So into the time travel piece of it, there's this. So in Chicago, we have the CTA. We have Chicago Transit Authority has the red line, which goes north and south. The blue line goes to the airport. And so I made up a train line called the gray line, which is, it may or may not exist. There's urban legends about it. And she starts hearing these urban legends again and discovers that there's a gray line stop under her record store. And after she gets up enough nerve and kind of comes up with a reason or two, she decides to go back to the 1990s, not just to relive it, but to kind of fix some things and make some amends with people and maybe try to redo things that she thinks will make her life better. But when she's back there, she just gets caught up, having too much fun, gets caught up in the music scene again, gets caught up experiencing things, and kind of doesn't really deal with her problems or commitment issues, things that are still, ever-present issues for her. And she has 90 days to either stay back in time or go back to the present where she started. And, kind of gets caught in a conundrum where she's got to figure it out and gets stuck in the 90s. And then a bunch of other interesting things happen. But because it takes place in Chicago, I wanted it to be very focused around Chicago pop culture history, the music scene here. I name all kinds of bands, a lot of bands from the 90s, probably like 250, 300 musical acts are mentioned in there in some form. Because she's engulfed in music, and obviously the Chicago Bulls of the 90s and Michael Jordan get plenty of mention as just a cultural phenomenon that was always around. But I think it's if you like pop culture, whether or not you follow the same bands that I do or people my age do, if you like pop culture, you like contemporary American history, I think it's a good read, and it gives you a chance to kind of see both the present and the past through someone else's eyes as they're trying to relive it. And maybe it's a reverse coming of age story. I'm not sure about that, but at the same time, I try to have the readers just kind of tag along. I mean, I could talk about movies in the 90s. There's a lot of movies that I really love that were pivotal in the 90s, like Pulp Fiction and Friday and Dazed Confused, where you actually feel like you're watching this movie, that you're tagging along with the characters and going on their little adventures. And that's probably the one thing I aimed for writing this book called 90 Days in the 90s. I wanted you to experience Chicago in the 90s and what time travel might be like if you could do it.
Definitely love Friday. Tell us about any current or upcoming projects that you're working on that people need to know about.
Yeah, right now I'm just kind of talking about this book. I wrote this book about Chicago, and Chicago's a big city. It's kind of slow going getting people to know that I wrote a book about the city and the music scene here. But yeah, I've been like doing some things at just like local music venues and bars, and kind of having not readings, but events where we talk about the book. So yeah, I don't have anything major coming up, but I'm just kind of putting it out there and kind of letting the community know about the book in different ways. And I'm not writing a second book yet, but I got a couple ideas that I'll probably unhatch, I guess, in the coming months. But just having fun talking about the 90s and talking about this book is what I'm doing now, along with just living life.
Throw out your contact information so people can keep up with everything that you're up to.
Cool. Oh, you can find me on Twitter at SportyFrye. So it's Sporty Fry with an E at the end, and same thing on Instagram. And obviously the website 90 Days in the 90s has a contact page, and you can order the book from there. If you order the book directly from me from 90daysin90s.com, I'll sign it, send it to you directly, and include some swag there. If you got people to buy for the holidays who are music nuts or history buffs, obviously a book like this would probably be, if you don't know what to get people, a book like this would probably be a good place to start.
I'll close us out with some final thoughts, maybe something I forgot to touch on that you would like to talk about, or just any final thoughts that you have. Yeah.
I don't really have any major thoughts other than I've just been blessed to be able to do what I do, to write for a living. And not everybody gets to do that. I've had some really good supportive people around me, helping me along the ways. And that's one of the reasons I keep doing it. So, be good to your family and friends, because they support you, and sometimes in ways you don't know.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you are a music fanatic or pop culture fanatic, Andy Frye, check out his book, pick it up, and please be sure to follow, rate, review, share this episode to as many people as possible. And if you enjoyed this episode or you enjoy the show in general, please be sure to tell a friend. Andy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
For more information on the Living the Dream podcast, visit www.djcurveball.com. Until next time, stay focused on living the dream.